When we buy something, we don't necessarily think, sometimes we do think, oh, where does it come, etc. And we come to the wrong conclusion. So we just, especially now with Trump's trade war against China, it's currently playing out in very predictable, volatile fashion. Many of his supporters believe his promise of bringing back manufacturing. This brings up a really interesting conversation about the enduring propaganda smears about China's labor practices, specifically around forced and child labor. This perspective is so widespread that not only do I get so many comments on all my videos about this, but Jon Stewart from The Daily Show actually did a bit on this and in response to DeepSeek, and you did a really good debunking on your TikTok about this. The irony, of course, is that the US, well, not of course, because I think a lot of people might not know this, that the US actually, all states permit child labor under federal guidelines, which, it offers some protections, but since 2021, at least 12 states have actively weakened these. Can you speak to the reality of China's robust labor laws in comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. And this has sort of progressed at the same time as the green initiatives in China have happened. So we're talking 2007, 8, 9 until today. And it's been a very long, hard process to fix this stuff because if you think of China, again, the world's factory, there are tens of thousands of factories all across every little square inch of the country. And I've been in more factories than I care to remember during my time in China. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen the pictures of the factory lines, and there are tens of thousands of workers in these factories as well. So shoring up those, making sure that they are meeting the right protocols. So even if the government is saying, hey, these are the regulations that we have, you better do it, that doesn't mean anybody's going to do it, especially if they're in a far-flung western region of China that nobody is ever going to inspect. How do they ensure that this is actually happening? So there's been a lot of auditing that's gone on. China and these factors have done a really great job bringing in third-party auditors, particularly those from Germany, which are very well regarded, to say, hey, yeah, this factory's signing off. It's great. A lot of the private sector companies that work in China, particularly those with really intricate supply chains that have been there for decades, they're also looking at these factories and saying, hey, we need to make sure that they're following what the government is asking them to do. So, some of the things China certainly has going for it right now when it comes to the regulatory environment around people and workers is strict working hours. And actually, I'm going to back up a step, and it's the same with everything with China. Everything anywhere, actually. Is everything perfect? No, because I can already see comments all over the YouTube videos saying, oh, well, what about this? What about... Of course, nothing's perfect. There's child labor all over the world. There's forced labor all over the world. It is a scourge that, many, many educated people that work at the international level are trying to get rid of. So it exists. Absolutely. Forced labor, migrant labor, child labor, all these things exist. In China, they've done a really good job trying to shore it up. So you have really strong restrictions on working hours. It is next to impossible to fire an employee without any sort of remit. So if you look at that compared to the United States, where many states are a work at will type of environment where you can just go into work and be fired for no reason. In China, that's next to impossible. You have to pay out huge sums of money if you are to fire anybody for no reason, and it has to be a very long, drawn out process before it can happen. There are benefits to being a worker, whether that's a factory worker or a white collar worker. Obviously, that differs depending on the city and the region and the government, but there are pretty good things. You go to some of these factory campuses and, people live on site. They have food provided 3 meals a day. There's gyms there, there's childcare if need be, and then you sort of work on site. For a lot of people, they hear that and they go, "Oh my God, that must be like slave labor." No, that's not it. That's not what we're talking about here. It's making it sort of one big community. So that's great if you're a white collar worker in some of the big cities. Your pay rate is going to be quite high compared to the rest of the country, but also compared to sort of a lot of developed democracies as well. One of my favorite little quirks is, and I don't know if this is just a Shanghai thing or if it's a China-wide thing, but when the temperature gets over 35 degrees in the summer, everybody gets an ice cream. So they think of little ridiculous things like that too, that is just sort of nice, like to let people know that they're thinking of the workers. And, if you look at China historically, right, the rise of the Communist Party is meant to be a workers' party. So of course they're going to be really strong on the labor laws. And maybe they weren't for, a couple decades, but they tried to fix it certainly in the recent past.
Yeah, I think just to further stave off some comments, I just, I think one of the things that's interesting about a lot of these accusations is that a lot of them are old. Like it could have been maybe 20, 30 years ago, when China was much more impoverished on one hand. And then the other thing is, I think the accusations of forced labor and child labor are as if China is actually doing this on purpose. Like that is
Exactly.
China's policy. And that's not, right? That isn't. So,
And there are places around the world where it may not be a written down, obviously, you're not going to write it down as a policy, but the government certainly encourages to happen. I'm not going to name names, but there are plenty of markets like that, which is an unfortunate reality that, again, people at the international level are trying to fix. China is not one of those markets. Maybe, like you said, they were 20 or 30 years ago, but certainly not now by any stretch of the imagination, because they understand as well. We think about, again, the strategy of the government. There's such a spotlight on the country. Why would they risk that when there's absolutely no need to have kids making your stuff in a developed market like China, which has such a decades old strong supply chain? Like they know what they're doing. It's very, very sophisticated, sophisticated to the point that it's now almost too expensive for any company to go into China if they're not already there. So companies are now looking for other markets around the region, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, to try to offset the costs because now China's no longer cheap China. It's too expensive to do business there.
yeah, and actually, I read in your greenwashing, the Great Greenwashing, you talked a little bit about automation. Can you expand on that? Because I think the labor force in China is changing, is moving, and that's certainly what you were mentioning before. So that's the perception again.
Yeah, so a lot of factories have become automated. I remember going into, I think it was one of my first factories I ever went into, because like I mentioned before, I did a lot of work in and out of factories. I went in and it was just totally quiet, and there were no people anywhere except for a couple of people running around operating the machines because it had been really well automated. Now, does automation work for everything? No, it doesn't. There are very big limits to automation, but those factories where it could be possible, people were upskilled to be able to run the machines, and everybody else was upskilled to go to a different sort of job, hopefully within the factory, but elsewhere if that was also an option for them. So automation has done amazing things to kind of lift everybody out of just being a blue collar worker into maybe something a little bit better, just a little step up on the social or income ladder from where they might have been on the factory line. And it's a lot safer than being on a factory line doing sort of the same rote things over and over and over again, which can be quite dangerous, particularly if the person happens to be a little sleepy.
And that's such a funny contrast because I hear a lot in the US when I was living there, this sort of like fear of automation. Automation is going to come and get your jobs and etc. So it's kind of a very different perspective.
Absolutely.